Sometimes, I hate that this country has 4 seasons. Just when I'm finally starting to forget, an autumn wind reminds me of a whispered insult. Winter skies bring back cold and lonely memories. And in summer, when the sudden evening storms arrive, I'm torn apart with every clap of thunder. Again and again, until there's nothing left. One year after my mother's relapse, things had quieted down. The commotion at the hospital created a bit of a stir around town, but it didn't take long for the talk to trickle to a halt. For one thing, the main character in the story was no longer a resident, and even our cold-hearted country gossip seemed hesitant to turn a gravely ill woman's condition into one of their nasty little jokes. I was absent from school for a week after the incident, recovering from the shock and a mild case of pneumonia, but my life eventually returned to its normal rhythm. That would be the superficial summary, at least. The trauma of reading that magazine article led to a dramatic downturn in my mother's condition. She was now suffering from acute memory loss. Her physician, my grandparents, my father, and me, we were all strangers to Mom now. Everyone she met slipped out of her mind within minutes. These symptoms were far beyond anything a local hospital was equipped to handle. Soon after the incident, Mom was transferred to a specialized psychiatric institution in North Kanto. Ironically enough, that divorce never actually came to pass. Perhaps my father backed off out of concern for his public image? That, or it was part of some conditional legal arrangement, I don't know. One thing, however, was perfectly clear. The connection between the Sakaki and the Kawamoto houses had been severed. My two families spent the first months after the incident squabbling by proxy about legal issues and the care of their mutual burdens. In the end, the Sakaki continued to cover my mother's medical expenses, but they were no longer providing supplementary support to the Kawamoto family's floundering business.
美佐子の件だけは責任を取らせたけど、これで支援もなくなって、どうするつもりですか、あなた。
つつましくやっていけばなんとかなる。すまんが、しばらくは我慢をしてくれんか。
歴史のある川本の家がこんな粗末な生活をするようになるなんて。しかもあの子の面倒まで見なければいけないなど、こんなバカな話がありますか。
まったく、なぜこんなことになってしまったのかな。
Even long after the matter was settled, my grandparents never seemed to tire of moaning about the unfairness of it all. And of course, as the easiest target for their bitterness, I once again found myself wedged between a rock and a hard place. I had the bare minimum required for a normal life. They always kept up appearances, after all. But not a day went by when I didn't hear sarcastic, scornful words from the shadows. I went to a silent school and returned to a silent home. I'd lost my refuge. I'd lost my hope. All I could do was suffer quietly. This would be the point where a normal person might go bad. But I had been living inside a cage for so long that not even the choice was available to me. There was a time, just once, when I tried approaching a group of girls with that sort of reputation. The result was pathetic. In that country town, even the delinquents were mindful of appearances. They turned their backs on me and walked away without a word. Shunned even by those lowest on the totem pole for a long moment. I just stood there, rooted to the spot. And then I found myself looking up into the sky. It looked no different from the day I gazed out the window with my mother. Strange how one scene can have two very different memories. Had Mom always been alone? Was that why she spent so much time watching something that never really changed? Now that I was well and truly isolated, I'd begun to think more about her feelings. It seemed like a moment worthy of a little sobbing, but it just wasn't happening. On that day in the rain, I'd used my lifetime supply of tears. All that was left was a parched, withered husk of a human being. For one long year, I did nothing but watch the sky change slowly above me. But as my first summer without my mother was coming to an end, I was pulled down to the muddy stream once again. A day early in September, our teacher had fallen ill that afternoon. The final lesson was replaced by a study hall, which I spent gazing dully out the window. That exercise in pure boredom finally complete, I was walking sluggishly down the road toward my grandparents' house, just turning the final corner onto our street. Something was wrong about this picture. A shiny black luxury car was parked along the thickly hedged road in front of our house. The Kawamoto family didn't own a private automobile. My grandfather apparently had one back in the days when the business was doing well, but it was one of the first things to go when the recession hit. The negotiations with the Sakaki family had always been held in the business office by the station, so it was hard to imagine why such a car would possibly come. For a little while, I dawdled outside, staring curiously at the car with its thickly tinted windows. But after 2 or 3 minutes, a voice called to me from inside our house.
遅かったじゃないの、由美子ちゃん。早く上がって。
She's being polite. Something's happened. I was startled. The friendly attitude was one thing, but it was the very first time since I arrived at that my grandmother called me by my name. She wouldn't have done that without a very good reason. After quickly removing my shoes, I let her usher me into the parlor. It was the first time in a good 4 years that I'd been in that room. The instant I crushed the threshold, 5 men in black suits stood up simultaneously and bowed in greeting. As I blinked in bewilderment, my grandmother spoke, a strange little smile twisting her face.
ほら、そこに座って。由美子ちゃんが話に入らないと進まないことなんだから。
And with that, she sat me at the end of the table, the dusty air of the rail-used parlor tickling my nose. I looked around me. All 5 of the men had deeply serious expressions on their faces. To be honest, I wanted nothing more than to run away.
一体何の話なんですか？こんな急に。
As soon as the question left my mouth, a man seated to my left took control of the conversation.
お父様、榊道明様の命により、
What?
由美子様をお迎えに上がりました。
お迎えに？
はい。お父様は昨年の一件で、由美子様をとても心配していらっしゃいました。それで、こうしてお迎えに上がった次第です。
Why does he care now? What on earth was this man talking about? After the incident with Mom, my father hadn't shown up in this house even once. I understood that he had a busy professional life, sure, but he didn't even bother to send a message or place a phone call. Now they've expected me to believe he was worried? Now, after a full year? Ridiculous. It was mystifying Grandma had even left them in the house, but let alone with that simpering grin on her face. Didn't she understand this was nonsense? But soon I discovered that my grandmother's reactions were perfectly lucid, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of that.
よかったわね、由美子ちゃん。これでいい学校に通えるし、お父様とも一緒に住めるのよ。
いろいろあったが、これからは何の心配もしないで暮らせるんだ。よかったな。
お父様からもまたこの家を助けていただけるそうで、本当によかったわ。
Ah. Now I understood. This was a question with no choices. My grandparents had decided the answer beforehand and were now unilaterally forcing me toward it. I was so profoundly astonished at their naked self-interest that I couldn't even manage any anger, but it's not as if snapping at them would have achieved anything in the first place. Remaining with them was probably never really an option.
わかりました。すぐに準備をしてきます。
When I stood from my spot, my grandmother spoke in a sickeningly sweet voice.
あらあら、そこまで急がなくてもいいのよ。榊家の方は明日もまたいらっしゃるというし、それまで。
いえ、結構です。今いらっしゃってるのなら、その車に乗っていきます。
あら、そうなの？由美子ちゃんがそういうのなら仕方ないわよね、あなた。
ああ、もちろんそうだ。由美子のいいようにすればいいからな。
I was about ready to vomit. From my grandmother's words, it seemed clear that Sakaki had come with a clear offer in hand, my return in exchange for restored financial support to the Kawamoto business. My grandparents had considered me a burden from the start, so I imagine they didn't really hesitate. It probably felt like selling some piece of junk from the backyard for a huge sum at auction. I tried muttering the words, but couldn't manage such conviction. After all, I was scuttling around the same sordid web. How could I complain? It wasn't working for my food. I pulled all the clothes out of my chest of drawers, threw them onto the tatami mat, and scowled down at them.
Sayonara.
I wasn't speaking to my grandparents, the house, or even to my mother. It was a farewell to the person who had lived there, idly wasting day after empty day, accomplishing nothing but growing older. I spoke those words to confirm a simple fact. That room was nothing to me. It held nothing of me. One by one, I cut the clothes I'd worn in the place to shreds. The expensive-looking children's clothes that I brought with me, the generic ready-made supermarket clothes my grandparents had bought me when the need arose, my middle school uniforms. My face an emotionless mask, I carefully chopped them into tiny pieces. My preparations were complete. Grabbing the scrapped clothes with both hands, I shoved them back into the chest of drawers. It took less than a minute to toss my everyday belongings, art supplies, and sketchbooks into my bag. Just like that, my life in that place was over. I didn't look back. After a stiff, formulaic goodbye to my grandparents, I dropped by my school for a few brief formalities, then began the journey home. Of course, I hadn't seen that home in many years. I had only the vaguest memories of the house itself. I was sincerely happy to be leaving my grandparents behind, but that didn't make it any less uncertain about the new life being thrust on me so abruptly. The car headed north at high speed, moving from the coastline into the outskirts of the metropolitan area. We were heading for the heart of West Tokyo. An elderly man who had introduced himself as the chief of the clerical department at my father's company was behind the wheel.
車が混んでいなければ、あと30分もすれば着くかと存じます。
Glancing briefly at his GPS screen, he answered my question in a calm tone.
そうですか。
60 kilometers, as the crow flies. That was the distance from my grandparents' house to that of my father. In the end, my mother had never managed to return to a place less than an hour away by car. And I myself was only coming back on somebody else's power. I didn't have the slightest idea what was coming next. I wasn't particularly hopeful, but I didn't feel much in the way of despair either. It would finally be enough if I could just spend my days quietly until I finally became an adult. With that thought, I closed my eyes and waited for the car to arrive at its destination. Just as the chief secretary had told me, we reached my new home about 30 minutes later.
Okay.
The house was very different from my patchwork image I had sewn together from fragments of my childhood memories. Far more magnificent than I had remembered it. From the outside, the building itself looked like a Western-style mansion straight out of a manga. It's always a manga. The spacious gardens were surrounded by a high wall. The grounds were covered in so many tall, beautiful trees that it could have been a park. I had hazy memories of those things, but after years in the country, their scale and magnificence took me by surprise. But on an emotional level, the sight left me cold. My father's actions were one thing. My obedient return at his whistle was another. No matter how splendid the house might have been, when I thought about the foundation it was built on, my thoughts naturally took a turn for the bitter. I whispered the words to myself, too softly for the driver taking my luggage from the trunk to hear. Passing through a finely wrought metal gate, I returned to the house I spent my first years in. The uninspired luxury was all the more pronounced inside the house itself. As I took off my shoes and looked around the gleaming entrance hall, I heard footsteps approaching from a side passage.
Yumiko, 戻ったか。大きくなったな。
It probably would have taken me some time to recognize the person in front of me, if not for the recent photograph I'd seen in a certain magazine 1 year before. Face to face with my father for the first time in what felt like decades, I saw a middle-aged man with a reasonably healthy complexion, but a subtle hint of something like gloom in his eyes.
ただいま戻りました。
As I lowered my head in a polite bow, my father continued in the same cheerful tone.
どうした？声に元気がないじゃないか。車に長い時間乗ったから疲れたのか。
I was more taken aback than anything else, considering the way he had treated me, Mom and me up until that point. His aggressively friendly attitude was incomprehensible. From what I could remember, my father and I all had only spoken a bare handful of times when I was a child. Certainly never like that. His motives weren't clear to me, but the sudden attempt at intimacy was off-putting. I didn't quite know how to respond to it.
大丈夫です。ちょっとお部屋に戻って休みます。
For the moment, I just wanted to cut the nauseating conversation short.
ああ、わかった。ユミコの好きなようにするといいよ。
失礼します。
With another bow to my father, I made my way past him, heading for the one part of the house I remembered well. My very first place of refuge, the bedroom in which I had spent so many hours as a young child. I climbed the stairs and found my room without the slightest hesitation. Remembering its location so exactly prompted a brief swell of nostalgic emotion, but that soon gave way to that recurring sense of disgust. My memories there weren't exactly happy in their own right. The room I entered for the first time in years was so completely changed that I couldn't help raising my voice in surprise. The badly mismatched desk and bed had been cleared away, and their place was a complete arrangement of fancy furniture and pretty little luxury items. Exactly the sort of things that might appeal to a girl of my age.
わざわざ揃えたのかしら。
Every part of the decor seemed as if it could have come straight from the set of a movie. The room was filled with fragile, ephemeral things. It felt as though they'd disappear like soap bubbles if I actually touched them. Normally, they would have made me happy. But at the moment, it seemed like a hollow gesture.
お母さん、帰ってきたわよ。
Sitting on the bed, I murmured those words to myself. I'd finally managed to return to that house. But my mother wasn't with me. All I had there was a forced artificial welcome from the man who had broken her. Would I simply resume the same numb, miserable life in a different setting? Staring up at the ceiling, I could feel the familiar jet-black sludge growing thick inside my chest. I fought down the crushing feelings of despair as best I could, closed my eyes, and fell asleep.